Hi, welcome to the third module of BA 461, Organizational Behavior. I want to start out today by talking about decision making in organizations. Decision making is something that we do on an ongoing basis as individuals and as members of an organization. Here's a definition. I brought in one from another source, and as you'll see throughout the lecture, I've tried to take some of the information from your textbook, but also supplement with some other sources that are also experts on organizational behavior. Very similar, but I think it helps bring some depth to the discussion. So this particular definition is really about, focuses on making choices, and I think among alternatives. And I think that is a pretty good explanation of what we do when we are looking at decisions. There are a couple of different types of decisions. Those that are fairly routine, we call them programmed, that we do on a regular basis and are pretty much done by an individual. We have knowledge, they're fairly routine, we're making choices. And then there are the non-programmed decisions, which occur less frequently, and they're more complex, and it requires a lot more effort and conscious effort on the part of the decision makers. One thing we need to be cognizant about is that emotions do play a part in our the making of a decision and choosing among various alternatives. Emotions help form preferences that we have consciously as we evaluate those choices, but the preferences are often more deep-seated and in our subconscious. How we, our moods and our emotions affect how we go through the process itself, and whether or not we actually listen to those emotions, whether we make very, very rational decisions or we use our gut or our intuition more, can affect how we arrive at our decision making. And each of us is a little bit individualistic in our preferences. So there's one model that we talk about a lot in decision making. It's called the rational model. There are various phases here, and this is from your textbook. It describes the various steps in this particular model. So you can see that the first one is problem definition. And I'm going to actually flip to a diagram. The words are a little bit smaller, but if you look at the chart and you start in the pie section where it says number 1, it walks you through the various steps, and it's a little bit more detailed. So the beginning with the problem identification, the first thing is to, be aware of the environment and the context. Then actually define the situation and the problem within that context, and look at our objectives, and actually finally diagnose what the problem is. A lot of times when, for instance, employees come to you as a manager with a problem, the problem they're describing is really a symptom and not the actual root of the problem. And so it's very important to step back before jumping in and taking action to make sure that you've actually diagnosed the correct problem. And then you'll investigate, gather facts, evaluate, and develop some alternatives. And then, of course, the next step is to make a choice among those alternatives. And lastly, to implement. And in my experience, the implementation process is often one that falls short. People spend so much time agonizing over a decision and then assume that the implementation just happens. And so this is can be a very frustrating place for employees in particular. The rational decision-making model assumes that when we make decisions, we have a lot of time. It is built on the premise that we have access to all the information available, that we have time to make decision, and that we can choose the very best solution out of all the various alternatives. And clearly that's not practical in the real world. First of all, we have constraints, and we have constraints on time, we have constraints on information, we can't possibly know everything about everything. And so it isn't really possible to choose the very, very best choice. And is that necessary, or do we need one that works well? So In reality, we use what we call the bounded rational decision-making model. And you can see that each of these boxes are constraints that are placed on our decision making. And at the top you can see we're limited in time and information and resources, etc. And we have to make trade-offs. Do we need a decision right now? Or, for instance, if a patient's down, not breathing, call 911. Are we going to look at all possible diagnoses, or are we going to jump in and do CPR? So depending, and that's an extreme example, but depending on the situation, time does not always allow us decision making. The more complex the decision, though, however, usually you have a bit more time, hopefully so. We also have our personal constraints, and those are our prejudices, our historical experiences that we bring to the table, our personalities, how we cope with decision making and pressures and conflict, and we make trade-offs with those as well. And then we also have constraints placed by the organization, which will have rules, regulations, protocols, and communication channels for proper decision making. So we take all of that into consideration, and we are literally bound and constrained by these things, and we make our decisions within this field of play. And that's a more practical way to look at it. We try to arrive at a decision that is good and will actually get us where we want to go. Here's a diagram from your textbook, which I think also gives a very simplistic look of how this model works. Another thing to consider is the process model, and this is reminds me of my friends in operations management, where it's very process focused and oriented. And these are a type where you're really looking at the process and making smaller incremental changes and choices. And as you can see from the screen, it's about decision making is controlled infinitely more by events and circumstances than by strategic vision or ideas of what a decision maker might want to do. So it's important to think about the circumstance and the type of decision that we're making as well. The legal model is really focused on a concern for order, political order, economic order, and so we look at, and again, this can be a constraint. We look at the principles and procedures that are in place within our society, but also within our organization. And so the law itself becomes our guiding principle. And if we think about this, for instance, in HR management, we know that we are bound by a lot of legal constraints and laws, and we need to make sure that we abide by those. The collaborative model reflects its name, and it's really focused on bringing people together and looking at complex issues that have multiple levels and affect a variety of people within a group or organization. And typically you're bringing together people so that you have input from a diverse group of people coming together and hopefully coming up with a really good decision that meets the needs overall. The garbage can model is interesting, and I am not going to spend too much time on it. I'm going to let you read a bit more about it in your textbook. I put some bullets up here on the screen that kind of describe some of the language that we use when we talk about this. But when you think about garbage can, you think about opportunities and think about the amount of energy that's thrown into problem solving and making these choices. And here is the diagram that follows in your book, and that gives you these choices of decision making by flight, resolution, or oversight. And this is somewhat common in organizations and something for you to take a look at. So given all of these different avenues that we can follow in our decision making, who should be making decisions and who should be involved in the process? It really depends on the decision and the situation, the constraints, and a variety of factors. So if it's an authoritative decision, it's usually made by one person or a small number of people, but it's typically an individual, and it's made on behalf of others in the organization. So an example might be a CEO or manager who institutes a new policy, and it could be, so for instance, they could say, we're now no longer having casual dress on Friday. And that would be a decision that everyone in the organization would be bound to follow. Consultative decisions are decisions that individuals make, but they seek guidance first. So in other words, we're still the individual decision maker, but we're doing it with input from a variety of sources. And then we have our group decision making, where we actually include members into the process, and we arrive at a decision by group consensus. And in looking at group decision making, one of the potential problems is a concept called groupthink. And you may have come across this in some of your other classes. I know we discuss it in ethics class, and I discuss it in some of my other classes. But for those of you who haven't come across it yet, I took the diagram out of your textbook to put up here, so it would give you some ideas of how this occurs and what this thing is. So basically, this is a group that comes together. They have success as a group in their decision making. They believe in the dynamic of the group and where they're going and the decisions they make, and believe themselves to be the authority and the answer. And so they avoid input from the outside. They suppress individual questioning, so everybody's on board with the group. And in the top of the screen, it talks about some of the conditions that can lead to this. The symptoms, the box in the middle, really give you an idea of what this thing is. And I like to say that groups begin to kind of drink the Kool-Aid, or another expression we hear sometimes is believe their own press. So if a group begins to have success and gains recognition for that success, they begin to think they're invulnerable and that their answer is always the right answer, and they don't want to deviate, which means they don't want to get additional input. And as we know, the world around us is changing all the time, so what worked before might not always work. And a group, though, because they believe that they are superior in their ability to make decisions, will reject any either outside or inside pressure to look at alternatives. And so there can be a little bit of bullying that goes on inside a group in an effort to suppress any dissension. And this can lead to poor decision making for obvious reasons, but it doesn't have to happen, but it is something that it's important to think about. And this is another reason for bringing diverse thinking into your group situations and diverse backgrounds and that sort of thing, so that we keep innovation inside our decision-making process. And one way to do this is through brainstorming, is to open up and let ideas flow. Brainstorming is important in organizations and helps in idea creation. There are some kind of rules of engagement that are important, and some of those are to set the rules so we know what we're talking about, and allow some time for people to generate ideas, reflect a little, and that kind of thing, and use sometimes activities that will allow for this idea creation. And there are a few things that you want to do to ensure that it is successful. One of them is when it talks about setting rules. It's very important that no, or that won't work, or any phrases like that are not allowed in the discussion. Regardless of how off the wall or how strange an idea is, it's a new idea. And if you begin naysaying, you're going to completely dampen the spirit of creative thinking. And so it's important to keep that at bay. And you never know. I might say, I think a green toad would be a great logo. And everyone around me might think that's the most stupid idea they've heard. But who knows, the person next to me, it might trigger some weird connection in their brain that would come up with a great idea. So it's about helping people go to a creative place in their head. And lastly, there are some things that we can do some building blocks for effective decision making. And again, I did take this from your reading, but it's similar to what we see among other authors. And it's really about defining the process and making sure that you're paying due attention to the process and getting to a good decision. I also think that it's important to know that there are some hang-ups that we have when we're in decision making, and this is where our personalities and sometimes our emotions come in. So I call this the know when to fold 'em advice. So there are some negative things that happen when we're in decision making. There is something called the escalation of commitment. Oh my gosh, we've spent 6 months or a year on this, we have to see it through. Well, seeing it through, if it's not going to be successful or if it's going to be a failure or cost the company even more money, is not necessarily a good reason to do that. Another one is over-optimism. So there are people who feel like no matter how bad it looks, it will be fine, it will be better, it's going to work. And a certain amount of commitment and belief in your ideas is very important. So I don't mean that, but being overly optimistic as opposed to realistic is not a good thing, and it can be a recipe for disaster. One that I love is this illusion of control. I had some managers who thought they could control the process and control everything, and of course that is an illusion, and it's important again to be realistic and pragmatic. So how do companies avoid this? As I mentioned earlier, it's important to have diverse decision makers and diverse input in decisions. And people with different ideas should populate a variety of groups. For instance, CEO should surround himself with people who come from different backgrounds, different experiences, and have different ideas so that they can all come together and develop a really successful game plan and make good decisions. Good decisions are facilitated by good communication as well, and this is particularly apparent in the implementation process. And communication is something that permeates all organizations. And I have to say, as an instructor, when I do case studies, it doesn't seem to matter what the subject is or what company the case is about. It invariably comes up as one of the answers to what went wrong is poor communication. So communication is critical, and many of us don't do it well. So it's important to spend a little bit of time understanding how it works. Here's just a very brief definition of what we mean by this. And you can see I have a diagram as well in just a minute. But basically, we want to communicate a message. As a sender, we encode that message and we in verbiage or means that we're going to transmit, and then we choose the communication channel over which to communicate it. That can be verbal, it can be written, it can be sign language, it can be email, it can be a variety of means by which we transmit this message. It's received on the other end, and that person then takes the message they receive and they do what we call decoding it based on what their understanding of that message is. And this is, of course, influenced by their background, their culture, their experiences, and so it may or may not be the exact same message. And this is where it's important to enrich the process. And then the very last step is the receiver acknowledges the message and that they understand it back to the sender. Here's a diagram, and you can see around the diagram I have these kind of lightning strikes with the word noise above them. And that's to demonstrate that when we send and receive messages, it is not in a pristine environment. There's a lot of noise on our channels, whether it's disruptions, it's real audio noise in the background, or an interruption of some sort of sensory item, a flash across the screen, who knows, an idea that pops in our head. There are constant stimuli around us at all times that we are subconsciously and consciously either accepting into our conscious mind or eliminating. So types of communication are important. When we often talk about communication, we assume people are talking about verbal communication, which is using the audio transmission of words. In this particular definition, they've added written. I would separate those two out. And then there's nonverbal communication, where you're not actually using words, so either written or verbal. And nonverbal communication is using some other way to express our idea, things like gesture or eye contact. And as you can see from the screen, our research shows us that up to 93% of communication is nonverbal. So for instance, if somebody is delivering a message using words in a oral communication, and it's a very polite oral message, but their use of nonverbal communication is angry and defiant, the message that's delivered is anger and defiance, not the polite verbal message for most of us. So it's important for us to be aware of all of these different channels and to also engage in what we call active listening. Active listening is different than just hearing somebody. It's making a conscious effort to really focus in and understand what the individual is communicating, and to be sort of open to ideas and open to the message, and block out things that might destroy that message before you have a chance to really give it consideration. So you can see some of the things here that we should practice are not to judge it initially, and not jump in and think we already know the answer before they finish telling us what the input is. And to make sure we give that feedback. It's really important to give that feedback where we sort of paraphrase what we understood. Supportive communication is, your book talks about this as well. And this is where we do a combination of things. We both are supportive and communicative as we enter into some sort of communication with others. And it's important for us to support the individual or individuals and the process of communication as we go through it. Dialogue is, as it says here on your screen, is a process and it's not an event. And so engaging in a dialogue really means that you've committed again to this process. And it's something that typically takes place face-to-face. So we're using our eye contact as well as any nonverbal and verbal cues. And it's important that we engage in this again with an effort that shows that we really are committed to understanding the message and engaging in a dialogue that becomes a two-way communication, not just a one-way. Electronic communication is a form of communication that's becoming far more common than it used to be. There are reasons for that. It's faster. We have a chance to sit down and compose. We can do it in an asynchronous manner. In other words, we could do it at 10 o'clock at night, knowing that person could open it at 8 the next morning. So we don't have to be in the same time zone. We can be in different locations physically than the other individual. And it allows us to then have some sort of trail of what's occurred in the thread of communication. So it's becoming, again, more and more common. But there are some real drawbacks, because in electronic communication, you've taken away one of the richest channels of communication, which is face-to-face. Given the fact that 93% of our communication occurs with nonverbal cues, and those are gone, it puts huge emphasis on your ability to communicate well in a written format. And a lot of folks don't take time to really do that. And getting an email sometimes from your boss, you can't tell if they aren't very articulate, if they're angry with you, or if they're in a hurry. And yet, if they were face-to-face, you could tell by their expression, because they're either angry or you can see that they're rushed, and we process all of that at the same time. So you've removed a lot of the richness of communication channels. So it's very important for us to try to incorporate that back in, and that's through our way of using words. Another thing that we see a lot in organizations is persuasion. And persuasive communication, typically we hope it comes from somebody who's considered an expert in their field, and we trust that what they're telling us is correct and important and has validity. So we think of them as being less emotional, and we look to our experts to influence our decision making in a way that gives us objectivity and helps us gather facts about something. So it's important in organizations to be able to seek that out once in a while. Another thing we see in organizations is personal counseling. And we talk more about this in human resources quite a bit, but here in organizations as managers, frontline managers deal with employee counseling probably more than HR managers do. And so we look at counseling individuals when we perceive a gap in performance and desired performance. So there are some things that we can do to correct those. And hopefully the first thing to do is to recognize and to jump in fairly quickly and determine what the situation is. Is it a lack of training? Is it a lack of desire to perform on the individual's part? What is the actual root cause of this? And oftentimes, by hearing the person asking them, we can find out what it is they're needing that they haven't gotten in. And many times we can provide that as a manager and help them be better tooled for the position that they're in. In doing so, though, we want to make sure that we are listening and we engage in active listening, that it's very focused on the work, the job itself. It should not be focused on the individual, but on job performance, and make sure that whenever you're counseling, it is always about the job and the job performance, not judgment about the person or their personality. So if somebody's always late, it's about their attendance and why that's important to the job. It's not about them being lazy and staying up all night. That is irrelevant to you. What you care about is whether or not they're at work and performing at the level that you need them to do. And then outlining where to go from here, giving objectives, helping them come up with a plan and how they're going to get there, and if need be, offer some resources in terms of training or other things that they might need. And of course, document. And I know you hear that a lot from those of us in HR, but it is truly, truly important and has saved me many, many times down the road. And even more importantly, it's very helpful for employees because they will do kind of a self-protection denial. And when you can show them, for instance, what's occurred over time, it's shocking to them. I had an employee who missed a lot of work. She called in a lot. And I don't even remember all the reasons. And it got to a point where it was a day a week on average every month. So every month, at least 4 full days. And we were a small office. It was taking a huge toll on the rest of the staff. So when we did our counseling, I was able to show her payroll records and how often, because she kept saying, I'm not calling in that often. And when she looked at it, she was completely shocked. So there is a certain denial that goes on. So it can be innocent. It's important, again, to keep it focused on the job itself. And, as part of counseling and communicating, it sort of leads us to the topic of meetings. And I know it's Many of us think in organizations we have death by meetings because people hold them and they're useless and you wonder why you're there and they're a waste of time. But they can be helpful, and there are some hints and some tips in your book on how to really hold a good meeting and communicate well. And I think it starts with an agenda and a purpose and a respect for everybody and their time and their input and involvement. And so here is this diagram from your textbook that gives you an idea on how to do that. And I think it's very appropriate, and we probably wish all of our bosses would take a look at this at some point. The last subject that I wanted to talk about today is working in teams and groups. And I think your textbook does a great job of outlining this, and I wanted to touch briefly on the topic as well. Here are a couple of definitions about, for instance, a group are a couple of people or more that come together for a task or a common goal. But a team is a more mature group with a higher degree of interdependence, and it has more commitment and towards the achievement of a goal and or task. There's a strong, as I said, a strong connection, and they're mutually accountable. And in my view, accountability in teams is probably the most important ingredient and the one that's usually missing. So again, from your textbook, here's a diagram on when teams might be effective, because teams are great, but not for everything. So for instance, on the left side of the diagram, it talks about if we look at the complexity of the task, the time involved, and the commitment level, when would you want to just have an individual do it versus a team do it? So for instance, if it's, should we buy a blue stapler or a black stapler, we don't need to convene a meeting of all employees to determine what their preference is, because the task is simple, the time should be minimal that's spent on that, and the commitment is very low level. Something that's far more complex than we might want to assign a team. Size really, really matters when we're putting together groups and teams, and it's important that we look at this. Your textbook suggests odd number is better because you can always break that tie, and just know that as you add more people to the group, the complexity increases and it becomes easier for those who are less comfortable participating to slink back and step back and let a few people take the lead. So it's important to manage those larger groups. Intimate. Smaller groups are more intimate and allow greater participation if it's possible. And then who should be in your teams or on your groups? How should they be comprised? If you get people who all think the same way and have the same background, you're probably going to come up with the same answer. And that's why I mentioned earlier a couple of times that diversity in your groups and teams and in your decision-making group is really important. Conflict is a necessary evil. It doesn't have to be negative conflict where it becomes very personal in nature, but out of conflict can you develop idea creation and a view. You have an opportunity to see a variety of views and inputs. And so, as I mentioned, diversity becomes important. Each of us has a role that we tend to play in teams, and we can move from role to role depending on our expertise or the task itself or the other members on our team. And so those are contributors, collaborators, communicators, challengers. And these are assigned based from the authors in your textbook, but other books have similar titles for the same type of role. And there is an opportunity, I believe, in your book for you to do a self-assessment and kind of find out which role you feel the most comfortable with and where you see yourself. And I think it's important for us to contribute where we can the most when we're part of a team. And so you can see that having each of these roles represented on the team can help increase the group effectiveness, and that is, after all, what we're striving towards. And we want to avoid some of the more negative roles where people have their own personal agendas, and that's represented in the box at the bottom, where an individual is really only concerned about what they will personally get out of their participation, not how well the team does or the outcome for the team or the organization. And in teams and groups, we established these norms of behavior, rules, I call them the rules of engagement, expectations of how we're going to function and operate. And these are very important to the performance of the team. If these norms are not identified early on, then you have a bit more chaos, conflict, and it's difficult for the team to come together and actually perform. Mature teams tend to develop them and work better, and as they do so, they begin to form as a more cohesive group. So it's very important. And a group, I know as an instructor, when a team has really come together and performing well, when I hear from students that they apologize that they let down and didn't turn in as great a personal assignment at the end of the term because they needed to spend the time that they had available for their team. And we do see that, and I applaud that. I think that's great. Then there is the opposite, where you see the individual who will spend hours and hours on their individual paper or their own presentation and not give anything to the team because they're going to get whatever grade the team gets in their mind. So, cohesion in a team is important, and it means that we voluntarily come together, and it's one for all and all for one. And yet, we want to make sure that we aren't conforming to an extreme, though, where again we become all alike, and this can set us up towards that negative outcome we talked about a little bit earlier in the lecture, groupthink. So cohesiveness is very important. Forming a false conformity is something that we want to keep an eye out for. I'm sure all of you have participated in teams, especially at school, where you've had that person, the deviant in the group, or the person that continually throws the monkey wrench in and makes it difficult for the team to come together as a cohesive group, destroys their creativity, is always saying that won't work, whatever it is. And that's a really negative influence and has to be dealt with. Preferably if the team can come together and apply team pressure and come back to those established norms, that is the best way to do it. Sometimes in extreme circumstances, you do have to fire the individual off the team. Not everybody is a willing participant, and some people are flawed in some ways, and you have to do what's right for the organization and the team. But hopefully, through a lot of hard work, you can accomplish what you need to accomplish with working around that person and bringing them within it. Here are some types of deviance, and I like this chart from your book because it gives you a chance to kind of read through them and look at, whether or not it's something that you can accept or reject and how that works. So I suggest that you take a look at this. If you need to, pause it for a minute if you haven't read it in the book, and absorb what they're talking about. Many of you have heard of Bruce Tucker's stages of team development. He formulated this several years ago, and it's still used in most of our textbooks and in our case studies about teams. And he originally identified 4 primary stages of team development. The first is forming, and that's where the team comes together and everybody is trying to make nice, and everything seems great, and we're just getting to know each other, and we're all going to try hard. And this is kind of where we set the stage for problems, because here is where, when we're forming, we need to establish important rules of conduct and behavior in our teams. And most don't. They want to be well liked. They also individuals assume that the others on the team are thinking the same thing they're thinking. And so everybody thinks they're on the same page, but they're not, because they don't talk about it. So it's very important to set down those rules of engagement here. And because most teams don't, they end up in what we call the storming phase. The storming phase is when the members start to jockey for position and control, because they thought everybody believed what they believe, and now they realize they don't, and their way is the right way, so they're going to try to assert that. And the other thing is conflict. How do we deal with conflict? We haven't figured out how to deal with conflict. So it's just chaos and negativity, and then it becomes personal. Unfortunately, storming is a stage that teams go through. It's a stage that you pretty much have to get through. And then there is the norming stage. Hopefully you get through storming and you get to the norming stage, when you circle back and you finally establish those rules of accountability and acceptance, and that an agreement in the team is going to adhere to those. And I liken this to, storming is where the clouds are dark and there's lightning and thunder and rain, and the norming stage is where the sun comes out and the air smells fresh and you can see the flowers, and that's great. But you're still not at the performing stage. You're just excited, you're just relieved that you're not storming anymore. The next stage is finally coming together as that cohesive team to really produce results. And we call that performing. And this is where you're pumping on all cylinders and you're working as one. So if you were rowing together on a crew team in a boat, your rhythm would be the same, you'd be the same strokes, everything would be in sync, and you would have great results. So here's a picture of that. And teams bounce back and forth among stages. So particularly if they're longer term teams. Now you aren't going to really see this in your school teams, because 10 weeks is really not long enough to get through all of this. In work, we know that our teams often are around a particular task or product development or process, and when that's achieved, they disband. And so we've added another stage called adjourning. And there are certain things that are important to do there as well, like celebration of results and closing the chapter, job well done, and figuring out where people are going from here and how to move forward. In the workplace, we also have different types of teams. I talked about process earlier. We have process improvement teams, and these are those incremental decision-making types of decisions I talked about. There are self-directed teams where they're pretty much put together as a team and allowed to decide where they're going and how they're going to get there. And we see these in more organic organizations, innovative organizations. You see it a bit in high tech. And then there are virtual teams, which we're seeing more and more of, where people are physically in different locations, so geographically dispersed around, or in time zones where they are communicating through virtual means. And as I mentioned earlier, and we were talking about communication, virtual teams rely a lot on email, but more and more they're also relying on other methods where you bring in video, like Skype or Google Hangouts, or other means of communication where everybody's coming together at once. Very important on virtual teams to figure out how to include these other channels of communication. If we refer back to our talk about communication, again, without the richness of the audio, the body language, the nonverbal cues, you can have a lot of miscommunication, and virtual teams can spend a lot of time circling back and solving problems that are really based on miscommunication. So one thing that I recommend, and you can see there's some here, some information here on your screen as well that I took from your textbook. But one of the things I recommend is, if at all possible, early on in the process, the team meets physically together. And that really establishes an opportunity for them to spend time sharing a meal together, a little bit of personal banter, and getting to know each other. And then when they go back, they have that opportunity to really communicate and understand a little bit more about the person, and that person's real. For instance, in Gresham, I teach a lot in a hybrid model where we have online component and an in-class component. So we might meet 4 weekends out of the term in person, but in between we're doing all of this dialogue online, and it really is much richer than the strictly online channel. So I wanted to offer, as we're summing up our discussion on teams, some information from a couple of scholars, Larson and LaFasto. They wrote a book, and it's dated in the late 1980s, and I think it's still true today, and they're often cited today, similarly to Bruce Tucker. And the book they wrote is What Must Go Right, What Can Go Wrong. And if you look at some of the things, these are characteristics of really highly effective teams, and you want to strive for these in your teams. And I think if you take a minute and look at them and see what's most important to you and where you see the teams that haven't done well that you've been on, what was lacking in those teams. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this module. The rest of the assignments are listed on the Canvas site. If you click on modules and go to module 3, it will list everything that needs to be done. And as always, if you have questions or concerns or want to share information, I'm always available either by cell phone or on Canvas. So thanks a lot, and I hope you're enjoying